in Europe, started gathering these dead together and naming them. So the bodies that they could actually find were put in named graves, and with a name on it, which you'll see in a moment. The bodies that were found but couldn't be identified were put in graves, usually individual graves, in some cases mass graves, with saying unknown. The mass graves, in some cases, would have a Bible verse, like from Isaiah, the Lord called you by name, to indicate that the Germans did a lot of that, to indicate that even though we can't name them, God will have the names. And then there were a whole bunch of bodies that just disappeared. So to give you an example from the British case, they're roughly speaking, a million dead of the British Empire. Roughly half of those dead could be identified. 250,000 bodies were found where you couldn't put a name to, and 250,000 people simply disappeared where you had a name and no body. So the people who were bodies that couldn't be named, and names that couldn't have a body attached to them, efforts were made to collect these names and put them on memorials as near as possible where these dead had been. So the battlefields of the First World War on the Western Front, and to some extent on the Eastern Front too, are covered with memorials that have names on them. So you see here names of these people. I showed you this Thiepval picture before. This is the one I think I have to remind you is the one that Maya Lin was studying when she was working on her undergraduate project that produced the Vietnam Memorial. And so you have this sort of big structure here, and on the walls of this structure are names. So these names represent, as I said again, these names represent bodies without names and names without bodies. Well, these here often look, okay? Now, this is on this issue of the reconstitution or the making of politics of the dead. This is in Australia. It's in Canberra, the Australian national capital, and this is the memorial to the Australian dead of the First War. It was the first building built in the new city, and what you see here is an axis, and this is the Australian Parliament. So the axis of the nation, so to speak, is between its parliamentary democratic institutions here and the dead that preserved them there. So, and what you see here also is then people do actually identify with individual dead at this place. So poppies are put, not randomly, they're put by relatives, families, in the names of the dead. So that's the sort of backstory then. So this I showed you, Gettysburg was number one, World War II was another, World War I was another big moment at this, and now the Vietnam Memorial. I should also add that the idea of being unknown, which was the lot of most humans for much of history, that is to say, most people's bodies, I would say 99.5% of all bodies, were put in the ground without anyone ever putting any kind of notice on, even at the time, and most of them would disappear in any case. It disappeared in any case. One starts being interested in actually being able to name and identify particular for dead bodies, as that's the place where that person is. And so we get to the Vietnam Memorial, which has this history going back to World War I, and there you have, of course, this famous, I'll show you a picture of it, the famous sort of wall in Washington. And what's important about this from your point of view, this idea of connection, is you see what the person is doing here. They're sort of tracing a name. So in some sense, the tracing a name, you have some sense that you're near the person. So recovering the name is something about recovering a person. It's a recuperative act. It's probably the most visited site in Washington, apparently. And if you go there, you find lots of people doing all kinds of things, like photographing, like tracing names, photographing themselves in the reflection, so you see yourself sort of amongst the names, leaving things. Whole warehouses of goods have been collected of the beer and the cigarettes and the notes and so forth that have been left on the places of these people, and that's become a kind of common form of memorialization. So this is not nearly as artistic, as artful, I should say, but this is the Veterans Memorial in Portland, Oregon, that speaks to the same notion. And so naming, and I can show you this all over the world. The Japanese do it. Lots of people do it. This is one, the Algerian War Memorial in Paris. These are the names, neon lights, of the soldiers and civilians and French allies who fought in the Algerian War. There's another memorial in Paris, the names, as far as they can be constructed, of the Algerian protesters who were killed by the police under the direction of a man named Poupon, who was also subsequently indicted as a Nazi war criminal. These bodies, they were killed at a demonstration and thrown into the river. Their names have been recuperated. Different memorial. So competing naming memorials is part of making competing political claims on public space. So that's the Vietnam Memorial model on the Thiep Val and the Somme, and its history. The Vietnam Memorial is really a version of Thiep Val. I mean, modernist version of Thiep Val, but the same story. And that carries out into other naming things. Now, this gets us to its naming in non-military situations and closer to human rights is of the Holocaust, the story of the Holocaust. Now, as I said, the main memorial of the Holocaust in Israel is actually a place of names. How would you literally translate Yad Vashem? Would it be place of names?
I mean, it's taken from a phrase in...
From what?
From a phrase in the Bible.
Yeah.
Right? But it just refers to remembering.
Right.
I don't know how to...
I mean, it's translated to me literally by a Hebrew speaker as connected with names, as a place of memory and a place of names. So...
placing a name, but never having it disappear.
Right, placing a name and not having it disappear. So the point then is the centrality of names in the production of this Israeli national monument to the dead of the Holocaust. And you'll see, this is Yad Vashem. There's lots of. This is just to show you what the outside looks like, and what you have inside then is monuments to testimony. So these are stories of people who died or murdered. It's collected, and then pictures, and they actually called the Hall of Names. So you'll see this form of commemoration when we talk about Cambodia in a moment. So keep this image in mind. This is like one of these images, like I showed you the image of starving people, which becomes a kind of canonical human rights image. This form of commemoration is a canonical form of commemoration, and you'll see this in a moment. So, for all the world, thousands of these pictures were collected, and hundreds of thousands of this testimony. And in fact, if you go online, you can put in a name and see if you can find the name of a relative. So, as many as possible of the murdered Jews can now be reconstructed through computing, when the old days could be constructed through card files. So, this is the same version of the Holocaust Memorial in Washington. The same story, and if you visit the Holocaust Memorial, I have mixed feelings about, and if you're interested, I can send you I wrote a review of it once, and I can send you this if you care. But be that as it may, the form of memorialization is very much like the one we've talked about with this issue of names. Now, just tell you this same thing in a different version. I mentioned these stones in an earlier lecture, and one of our grad students is actually working on this as a dissertation project now. The idea of rather than having a single memorial, which remembers something, you have a bunch of Stolpern in German means the trip, and so the idea is that you put a bunch of stones or markers around over which you'll trip. So you'll be forced to remember this name. You'll be nudged out of your complacency by the fact that you trip over this. And you trip over this stone. Her dissertation is really about the issue of the decentralization of memory. So the spatial dispersion of memory, and yet keeping track of the fact that there are actual people who were in these places. And so what you see in this thing is, in this place lived Alice Kozoner, who was deported to Theresienstadt in 1943 and murdered at Auschwitz. And here, Martin Hammerschmidt, who was born in 1895, who was deported on the 8th of April 1943 and was murdered at Auschwitz. So each of these stones represent a person that you were supposed to trip over. In Paris, you find the same thing. You find on many houses permanent plaques in which you say, from this house, this group of people, we're deported, not just Jews, but others with the complicity of the French government and sent to camps of their death. And on the day in which the most important of these deportations happened, all over certain parts of Paris where Jews lived, you'll find signs in the window with the names of the people who lived there saying they were deported on that day. So there's that version of it. Now, just to jump the other direction, there's a memorial at the concentration camp of Treblinka from which we have almost no names. Treblinka was a concentration camp in which people were murdered more or less instantly. So there are almost no survivors. And unlike Auschwitz and other camps where people were actually checked in and checked out and someone paid attention to some of them, this place exists only to murder people. And some people were actually not there very long. So we have almost no names. And so what you have here is a field of stone, which is meant to represent each of these individuals. Now, I think I did show you a version of this before, but so you again, this is a monument in Berlin where from which the trains went to concentration camps. It's on the outskirts of Berlin because the Nazis were embarrassed to do it at the main train station. And it doesn't exactly have names, but it lists precisely which day on which train how many people went. So it's this idea of specifying from a place, in this place, this happened. Right? So it's this. It's evidence for the crime, and it's a hint to these kind of specific people. And so here you get it on the 27th of November, 41, 1,035 Jews were sent to somewhere. Sort of a terrifying sight if you ever go to Berlin. It's in a very beautiful, one of the richest, maybe the richest suburb of Berlin, and there's a great sort of tunnel that goes on the railway tracks, and they brought all these Jews in from all places to Berlin, and they kept them in this horrible tunnel, 1,000 people in this tunnel. And then they sent them off on these what would have been commuter trains, so no one could actually see them. I mean, they kept this slightly secret. It's a scary thing. It's scary right now because it's so beautiful. I mean, it's leafy mansions, and it's quite a place. If you're in Berlin, I'd recommend you should see it. Well, the Holocaust Memorial in Paris is this list of names. That's right behind Notre Dame. Père Lachaise, this great cemetery where they don't name it, but in this monument, you'll see a plaque in front of it, are ashes brought from concentration camps. So the Parisian, what can be imagined to be Parisian Jews are repatriated and brought back in this sort of moment of reconciliation. All right, so that's the Holocaust part, but we have this, yeah, sorry.
Did you just say that statue is built of ashes?
Has ashes under it.
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry, no, if you go to Père Lachaise, in many cemeteries, ashes were brought from concentration camps and reburied under these monuments. Now that in itself is sort of an amazing act of magic. I mean, these ashes could be just cinders. I mean, we imagine them to be ashes of the dead, and they were from concentration camp. There's no distinction between ashes from the dead and ashes from a fire. I mean, so this is kind of a whole other story about how we make the dead who are really nothing into something. But I want to leave, that's another problem. I'm just saying, in fact, what they do is either name the dead or suggest you can't name the dead or repatriate the dead in these monuments. Well, so there's civil society versions of this as well, and not just the dead of war. And I just want to hint at some of this to you by showing you that the main AIDS Memorial Project is called the Names Project. Started in San Francisco. If any of you guys are ever looking for a kind of interesting research project in gender studies or in history or a related topic, the archives are here, and they're pretty amazing archives. They're now in the San Francisco Library, so I recommend this to your attention if you're looking for a longer-term research project. And what was done here was, beginning in San Francisco, people with the increasing number of especially in the early 80s, when people really died from AIDS pretty quickly, of dead people, dead young people, mostly men, some women, and there was this horror that they were simply disappearing and no one noticed. And especially since it was like embarrassing to die of AIDS, there was often no public remembrance of it, no public notice, and people, in some sense, disappeared, not as literally disappeared as in the Argentine, but disappeared. So there's an effort made in the gay community, in a parade, to carry around the names of people in parade to sort of recognize these people as a member of this community. And from this grew the idea of making a quilt, which was sort of this familial, in the American